by the intelligence and beyond the reach of the senses, wherein established, he no longer falls away from the truth. So the 21st and 22nd verses of this chapter describe a person who's successful in attaining union with God and who reaches this great state that we described in the previous verse. The first thing that Sri Krishna uses to describe this experience is atyanta sukh, which means a supreme delight. So sukh, everyone knows, means delight. This is the experience of this person. So on the majority of these occasions, on the majority of occasions that we have in our day-to-day lives, the happiness that we experience is through our senses. So any practice, habits or limits that we have, that we experience in terms of when we experience our happiness is through the senses. If we eat something like nice or chocolatey, we get happy because the tongue likes it. The tongue is a sense organ, and therefore this happiness is experienced through a sense organ. If we listen to a beautiful song, or we listen to a beautiful discourse, then this reaches our ears, and we perceive this through our ears, and our ears are sense organs, and therefore the happiness was also experienced through the sense organs. If we see a beautiful picture or a beautiful face, then we get happy because our eyes like it. If we touch something nice and soft, then the skin will like it. If we smell a beautiful rose, then the nose is happy. All of our happiness is experienced through the senses. Until this age, all we've experienced is happiness through the senses, but nothing else coming in the middle. And we haven't experienced, it's hard for us to experience happiness when words, smell, appearances, touch and sounds aren't there. So for example, if we try to remember, if we all try to think of an instance where we experienced happiness, but there were no senses involved, and the senses of action and the mind were not involved, it's quite difficult. And this is because the supreme delight is experienced in this the way we experience supreme delight is experienced is described in this verse. We have no experience of happiness when the mind and the senses weren't there. Shri Krishna says in this verse that one reaches this state, and the happiness that he gets, which is atyanta sukh, which is the supreme delight, is such a supreme delight that it is beyond the reach of the senses. So the word atrindriyam is actually translated as beyond the reach of senses, because it can't even be perceived by the senses, and it can't even be understood by the senses. It's not measurable by the senses. That's why Sri Krishna uses this word. It's beyond the senses, and that's this level of the happiness. Only that which is inferior to the senses can be perceived by the senses. This happiness is greater than the senses, and therefore it can't be perceived by the senses. The scriptures say there's another reason for this. In the path of Dhyan Yoga and attaining the soul, one can only be successful when he leaves external objects behind. The practice of the mind and the senses is to look outside. They wish to look outside and to make contact with matter and to run for happiness after matter. This is the experience of the senses. They always look outside. The mind also looks outside. Therefore, until the mind and the senses are looking outside, one is not able to attain meditation. One who wishes to practice meditation needs to be free from external objects, and therefore he'll be able to perform dhyan. So for example, if Guruji says, if you go outside the house and you can go to the cinema, but if you stay inside your house, you're not able to go to the cinema. And the moment that you decide to stay inside the house, it's a basic example, but you're then free from the cinema. In the same way, when you stay in dhyan, external objects will go away by themselves. The senses can't come inside because their practice is to grab things on the outside. That's why Sri Krishna says that supreme delight is beyond the reach of senses. This is because the power of the senses is outside. The capacity of the senses is outside, and the understanding of the senses is also outside. But dhyan is a practice on the inside. So meditation is a practice on the inside. So there's a strong difference between the two. There's a small example. So if you imagine when you donate money to a worthy cause, which sense organ is it that you actually perceive happiness from when you make that donation? It's actually really difficult to say which one you perceive it from. It's not your eyes, your ears, your nose, your mouth. There's no touch organ which is involved. So how can you think that it's from a sense organ? That the happiness that you get is actually from your mind. Now the point that you know where these five senses aren't involved, but you still get happiness, it's not actually a subject of the mind. The happiness doesn't even come from the mind, such as this happiness. All our good deeds, such as donation, compassion, etc., and empathy, are all steps in the middle, in that at least they take us slightly higher than the material world and at the mental level where one is free from the senses. But the person has to move away from the grip of the mind, and there comes the sukh and the movement away from the senses. The senses can't perceive this happiness. Therefore, who can experience this happiness? Shri Krishna says in this verse that it's supreme delight. And how do we know that it's supreme delight? If the senses can't perceive it, then how will we perceive this? Shri Krishna uses the word here, buddhi grayam. And the answer to the question is that it's your intellect that experiences the happiness. The senses don't perceive it, and this supreme delight is only perceived by the intellect. The intellect perceives it, and the word buddhi, which is on the second line of this verse, is the word for intellect. It's experienced through the intellect. The happiness can only be understood by the intellect, and the reason for this is because the nature of the intellect means it's not interested in making contact with external objects. This is its very nature. The mind runs a lot, and when the intellect forgets the self, or in other words, if the soul doesn't control the intellect like it should, and the person doesn't have awareness of the self like you should, and all of this goes away, the intellect will begin to start running after the mind. The intellect has in this case escaped from the string that was meant to pull it, and the intellect has started running after the mind. And this is why we think that the intellect is doing everything. In reality, the intellect has no interest in external objects. When you eat food, the mind is interested in eating that, but not the intellect. If you smell a beautiful rose, then it's the mind that's interested in it, but not the intellect. The intellect is not interested. The reason for this is that the intellect walks side by side with the soul. The union of the intellect is always with the soul. The very fact that it's stated in, this very fact is actually stated in the story of someone called Puranjan at the end of the 4th canto of the Bhagavad in chapter 5. There was actually a king called Puranjan, and he represents, it's like a metaphor for the individual soul. So you, I, all of us, we're all Puranjan. Now this particular king went out looking for a city for himself to live in. He went through different lands and different countries, but he didn't like any of the land which he saw. And in the end, he liked a city of 9 gates where he began to live. The city of these 9 gates is the human body. And this individual soul, Puranjan, arrived in the body, which is the city of 9 gates. Now one time, Puranjan was walking around the city and he saw a beautiful, attractive woman named Puranjali. Puranjan was very attracted to her, so he went to Puranjali and proposed marriage to her. Puranjali accepted. Now Puranjali represents the intellect. So Puranjali is the intellect. The individual soul came and resides in the body. Then when the individual soul becomes 2 years of age, or 4 years of age, or 5 years of age, then suddenly this individual realizes that he has an intellect. A very young child isn't aware of his intellect, but once he gets to a certain age, he becomes aware of his intellect, and he starts to think, well, this is my intellect. Then for 16 or 17 years, he'll only do something that registers with his intellect. He'll say, this is what my intellect is saying, and therefore this is my opinion. Puranjan got married to Puranjali and began dancing to Puranjali's tune. Therefore, the individual soul dances to the intellect's tune. This is how the Srimad Bhagavad describes in an advanced state this short story, that the individual soul dances to the intellect's tune. The intellect walks with the soul, and the intellect has no interest in external objects. The intellect has no interest in staying outside. Therefore, if we think about it, any external object with the intellect, if you think about any external object with the intellect, then the intellect shows you the futility or the uselessness of that thing. This applies to any external object, whether it's sweets or material objects. If you think about it for 5 minutes, then the pleasure of that thing will go away. One only has pleasure from that sweet when one sees it, smells it, or when water comes out of one's mouth after one has eaten it. So then, once again, it's through the senses. One can only derive pleasure from it in that way. If, however, they're just laid out there, and you're thinking about it with your intellect, who could have made it, where could it be from, what will it be like, and how would they have made it, you start to lose interest in it. This is just the basic example of sweets, but it could apply to any object. If you start thinking about it with the intellect, then the intellect will show you the futility of that object. This is why, when a person enjoys a material object, he can't enjoy it with the intellect. He can only enjoy it when he puts the intellect to one side. One can only have objective happiness when he has his intellect at his side. All these objects are like Hindi films. If you try to run your intellect against them, then you won't enjoy them. You need to leave your intellect outside the cinema before going in to see the film. You need to give it as a gift to the gatekeeper and say, give me a half-price ticket and take my intellect in return. Only then will you be able to enjoy it. Otherwise, you'll not be able to enjoy it. one's whole life will go in this way. One's whole life could be perhaps nothing but a Hindi film. As soon as you register your intellect with it, then the charm will go away. I've definitely experienced that when you're watching a Bollywood film. If you try to overthink it, it doesn't make sense. So this is why we should put the intellect to the side. So when a person thinks, thinks too much about these sweets, immediately they won't get the pleasure from those external objects. All the people that perform penances such as Buddha and Mahavir Bhagwan, they all learn the futility of the world through their penances and through their meditation. And this is the work of the intellect. The intellect has no interest in external objects. The intellect is the partner of the soul. It is actually in union with the soul. The happiness of samadhi and this particular state of supreme delight is only where the intellect can understand this and the intellect can experience this. The senses, again, can't experience this and the senses can't perceive it. Shri Krishna then says in this verse that once a person has experienced the supreme delight and has become steady in the supreme delight, then he no longer falls away from the truth. Such a person has no other business apart from the truth. So if any fictional character had performed dhyan 2 or 3 times, then you can make him go away from dhyan. But if you tell Mahavir Bhagwan or Buddha that he shouldn't perform dhyan anymore, then he will say that he is in dhyan 24 hours a day. If you tell Buddha that he shouldn't perform dhyan, then he will say, well, this isn't possible because I'm always in dhyan and I'm always in that state. A yogi who reaches this state never falls away from the truth, and he never falls away from Swarup, which is the form of God. The next verse briefly describes the second set of consequences when one is successful in attaining union with the soul, and one who reaches the advanced state of this meditation.